I found my grandson Marcus collapsed in the alley behind his restaurant at 2 in the morning. His white chef's coat was soaked through with blood, his face swollen beyond recognition, and his right hand, his cooking hand, was bent at an angle that made me want to scream. The January wind whipped through downtown Chicago, cutting through my thin coat as I dropped to my knees beside him, my arthritic hands trembling as I searched for a pulse. "Marcus, baby, it's Grandma. Stay with me, sweetheart." His eyes fluttered, barely slits through the swelling. His lips moved, and I had to press my ear close to hear him over the sound of distant traffic and my own ragged breathing. "Grandma," he whispered. "It was Vincent." He said people like us will never own anything in their city. The Hartleys, they sent him. Then his body went slack, and I thought I'd lost him right there in that filthy alley, surrounded by garbage bags and the smell of grease from restaurant vents. I screamed until a bartender from the jazz club next door came running. He called 911 while I held my grandson's hand and felt something fundamental change inside me. Not break, transform, crystallize into something cold and hard and patient. My name is Ernestine Cooper, and I am 68 years old. I have worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families on Chicago's North Shore for 45 years. I raised 4 children after my husband Samuel died of a heart attack at 42, working himself to death at the steel mill, while I scrubbed toilets and ironed sheets for people who never learned my last name. I know what it means to be furniture to people with money, but what those people never understood is that furniture sees everything, and furniture remembers. Marcus survived that first night, but barely. Fractured skull, broken ribs, punctured lung, shattered hand. The surgeon told us they'd done their best, but she couldn't promise he'd ever have full use of his fingers again. For a chef who'd spent 15 years perfecting his craft, who'd finally saved enough to open his own restaurant in Bronzeville, that was a death sentence of its own kind. My daughter Pauline, Marcus's mother, flew in from Atlanta. We sat vigil at Northwestern Memorial, watching machines breathe for my grandson while nurses moved in and out like ghosts. Pauline hadn't slept in 3 days. Neither had I. The police came on day 4. Detective Robert Okafor, tall and serious, with the kind of careful eyes that miss nothing. "Mrs. Cooper, your grandson mentioned someone named Vincent before he lost consciousness. Do you know who that might be?" "His business partner," I said, though the word tasted like ash. "Vincent Hartley. They opened the restaurant together 18 months ago." Detective Okafor's pen stopped moving. "Hartley. As in the Hartley family?" "The same." Anyone who'd spent time in Chicago's food and hospitality scene knew the Hartleys. 3 generations of restaurant empire builders, starting with old Morton Hartley, who'd opened his first steakhouse in 1952. Now his grandson, Harrison Hartley III, controlled a portfolio of 47 restaurants across the Midwest, sat on the board of the Illinois Restaurant Association, and had the mayor on speed dial. Their family name was on the culinary school at DePaul. Vincent was Harrison's youngest son, 29 years old, prep school educated, and according to Marcus, completely different from his family. He'd approached Marcus 2 years ago at a food festival, said he was tired of corporate restaurants and wanted to invest in something real, something that served the community. He'd put up $400,000 for a 50% stake in Marcus's dream. Marcus had been so excited. "Finally, Grandma," he'd said, "someone who gets it. Someone who sees me as a chef, not just a diversity hire." I'd had my doubts from the start. You don't spend nearly half a century cleaning houses for rich families without learning that their children rarely fall far from the tree. But Marcus was 32, brilliant, and determined. What could I say that wouldn't sound like an old woman's paranoia? "We'll need to bring Vincent Hartley in for questioning," Detective Okafor said. "Good luck with that," I replied. "The Hartleys have more lawyers than I have grandchildren. And I have 9 grandchildren." Sure enough, within 8 hours, Vincent appeared at the hospital with a legal team. 3 attorneys in suits that probably cost more than my car, plus a PR consultant who handed out cards to anyone who looked like they might be press. Through the waiting room window, I watched Vincent talk to the lawyers, his face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't reach his eyes. When Marcus woke up 5 days later, his memory of that night was gone. The neurologist said it was common with traumatic brain injuries. He might recover fragments over time, or he might never remember what happened after leaving the restaurant at closing. The police found no witnesses. The security camera in the alley had mysteriously malfunctioned that night. Vincent claimed he'd been at a Hartley family dinner in Lake Forest until midnight, with a dozen relatives who swore he never left. The timeline was tight, but possible. Without Marcus's testimony, without witnesses, without evidence, the police had nothing. Detective Okafor told me he was sorry, that he believed something terrible had happened, but believing wasn't enough. I nodded and thanked him for his time. But inside, I was already planning. Because I remembered what Marcus had whispered to me. The Hartleys sent him. Not Vincent acted alone. The Hartleys, plural, the family. And I knew something about that family that not even Marcus knew. A week after Marcus was discharged, I went to see my brother George. He's 72, lives in the same South Side house where we grew up, 2 blocks from where our mother spent the last years of her life. George had worked maintenance at the Drake Hotel for 30 years before his back gave out. Between the two of us and our sister Bernice, who passed away in 2019, our family had spent over 100 years serving Chicago's elite. George opened the door in his bathrobe, reading glasses perched on his nose. "Ernie, heard about Marcus. How's he healing?" Slowly. "George, I need to talk to you about Mama's boxes." George went still. His eyes, so much like our mother's, searched my face. "You mean her records?" "I mean her records." Our mother, Delphine Cooper, had cleaned houses on the North Shore for 52 years, from 1948 until she retired in 2000. She'd worked for the Hartleys from 1963 to 1978. During that time, she'd seen things, heard things, and unlike most housekeepers who learned to forget what they witnessed in the homes of the powerful, our mother had remembered. More than that, she'd documented. "Mama always said those records were insurance," George said slowly, "that we should never use them unless there was no other choice." "My grandson almost died in an alley, George. His hand might never work right again. The people who did this are going to get away with it because they own half the politicians in this city. I'd say there's no other choice now." George led me to his basement, to a corner stacked with plastic storage bins. Inside one of them, wrapped in old pillowcases, were 9 spiral notebooks and a shoebox full of photographs, receipts, and documents. Our mother had been a quiet woman, but she'd had a steel spine and a memory like a filing cabinet. She'd started keeping notes in 1952 after watching her employer's husband bribe a building inspector. By the time she retired, she had detailed records of tax evasion, insurance fraud, illegal labor practices, bribery, and in the case of the Hartley family, something much worse. I spent the next 2 weeks at George's kitchen table, reading through our mother's careful handwriting while Pauline helped Marcus with physical therapy and tried to convince him to move back to Atlanta. The notebooks painted a picture of Morton Hartley that the public never saw. The beloved restaurateur, the philanthropist, the man with a building named after him at Northwestern, had built his empire on intimidation and violence. There was a competitor named James Okonkwo whose restaurant burned down in 1967, 2 weeks after he refused to sell to Morton. Insurance ruled it arson, but no one was ever charged. There was a health inspector named Patricia Wells who suddenly changed her findings on a Hartley restaurant in 1971 after her son was badly beaten outside his high school. There were payments to city aldermen, payoffs to union officials, and money flowing to men my mother simply described as Morton's problem solvers. But the entry that made my blood run cold was dated March 15, 1974. Today I was cleaning the study when Mr. Morton came in with his son Harrison. They did not see me behind the curtain. Harrison, who is about 20 years old, was very upset. He kept saying that Raymond had it coming, that Raymond was going to talk to the police about the warehouse. Mr. Morton told Harrison to calm down, that it was taken care of, that Raymond Beaumont would never talk to anyone again. Then he said something I will never forget. He said, "Son, this is how we protect what's ours. You have to learn this if you're going to take over someday. Sometimes people need to disappear." I remembered Raymond Beaumont. Everyone in the neighborhood remembered Raymond Beaumont, a black businessman who'd owned a small trucking company and vanished in March of 1974. The police said he'd probably run off to avoid debts. His wife Corinne had always insisted he was murdered, but no one with power had listened to her. She died in 1992, still waiting for answers about what happened to her husband. Mama had documented conversations, dates, descriptions of men who came and went from the Hartley house. She'd secretly photographed documents she found in Morton's trash, check stubs and receipts that showed payments to people with criminal records. She'd kept newspaper clippings about incidents that correlated with her observations. It was a mosaic of corruption spanning nearly 2 decades. And according to these records, Harrison Hartley II, now 71 years old and chairman of Hartley Hospitality Group, had been learning his father's methods since he was a young man, which meant Vincent hadn't gone rogue when he attacked Marcus. He'd been following the family playbook. I called my friend Loretta Washington, a woman I'd known since our children were in elementary school together. Loretta had put herself through law school at 45 after her divorce and now ran a small civil rights practice in Hyde Park. She'd never lost her South Side roots or her distrust of the powerful. "Ernestine," she said after I explained what I had, "do you understand what you're sitting on? This isn't just about Marcus. This is racketeering. This is RICO. If these documents are authentic, if we can connect them to current criminal activity, the FBI could take down the entire Hartley operation. How long would that take? Federal investigations can take years. Marcus doesn't have years. His restaurant is hemorrhaging money while he can't work. Vincent's lawyers are already trying to force a buyout at pennies on the dollar. And if they realize Marcus is starting to remember..." I didn't have to finish the sentence. "There might be a faster way," Loretta said. "Let me make some calls." 3 days later, Loretta introduced me to Special Agent Michelle Torres of the FBI's Chicago field office, specifically the Public Corruption Unit. Torres was in her late 40s, Latina, with the kind of calm intensity that suggested she'd seen worse than anything I could show her. "The Hartley family has been on our radar for years," she admitted. "We've suspected Harrison Hartley of bribing city officials to get favorable treatment for his properties, but we've never been able to make anything stick. He's too careful, too insulated. What if I told you I have documentation of his father's criminal activities going back to the 1960s? Documentation that shows a pattern of violence, bribery, and possibly murder that Harrison witnessed and participated in as a young man?" Agent Torres leaned forward. "What kind of documentation?" I told her about my mother, about the notebooks, about the photographs and receipts and check stubs, about the disappearance of Raymond Beaumont and my mother's record of what she'd overheard. "And this connects to your grandson's assault, how?" "Pattern of behavior," I said. "The Hartleys have been eliminating threats to their business for 3 generations. My grandson's restaurant was becoming too successful. He was getting media attention, winning awards. Vincent and his family couldn't stand that a black chef from the South Side was outshining their establishments. When Marcus refused to sell his share, they decided to remove him the way they've always removed problems." "That's a theory," Agent Torres said carefully. "It's more than a theory. My grandson remembered something before he lost consciousness. He said the Hartleys sent Vincent. Not that Vincent acted alone, the family was involved. Memory from trauma victims can be unreliable. Then help me get reliable evidence. You have resources I don't have. Subpoena power, forensic accountants, the ability to make Harrison Hartley nervous enough to make mistakes." Agent Torres was quiet for a long moment, then she said something that changed everything. "Mrs. Cooper, there's something you should know. 6 months ago, a former employee of Hartley Hospitality came to us claiming he'd been asked to set fire to a competitor's restaurant. He was willing to testify, but he died in a car accident before we could get his full statement. Single vehicle, late at night, no witnesses. The case was closed as drunk driving, but his family insists he never drank." Jesus. If your mother's documents are authentic, they establish a 70-year pattern of exactly this kind of activity. Combined with Marcus's statement and the suspicious death of our witness, we might have enough to open a formal investigation. More importantly, we might have enough to make the Hartleys very uncomfortable. Uncomfortable how? I learned long ago that powerful people have one weakness. They believe they're untouchable. When they discover they're not, they panic. And panicking people make mistakes. The meeting happened on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room at the FBI's Chicago field office on Roosevelt Road. Agent Torres had arranged it as a voluntary interview, which meant Harrison and Vincent Hartley arrived with their usual army of lawyers, but without handcuffs. At least not yet. Loretta and I sat in an observation room behind one-way glass. My hands were shaking, so I pressed them flat against my thighs. Harrison Hartley III entered first. I'd seen him from a distance at charity events over the years. One of those distinguished silver-haired men in expensive suits who always seemed to be shaking hands with someone important. Up close, he looked older than his 71 years, with the kind of permanent tan that came from winter trips to Palm Beach and a lifetime of never worrying about money. Vincent came in separately, looking nervous. When he saw his father, some of the color drained from his face. I wondered if this was the first time he'd realized that the family business might actually catch up with them. Agent Torres began by placing photocopies from my mother's notebooks on the table. She explained, calmly and methodically, that the FBI had come into possession of documentation spanning 5 decades of Hartley family business practices. She mentioned names: Morton Hartley, James Okonkwo, Patricia Wells, Raymond Beaumont. When she said Raymond Beaumont's name, Harrison Hartley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But I saw it. I saw the fear flash in his eyes for just a moment before he covered it with decades of practiced composure. "These are obviously forgeries," Harrison's lead attorney said. "Fabrications designed to—" Agent Torres held up a hand. "The documents have been authenticated by our forensic analysis team. Paper composition, ink aging, and handwriting analysis all confirm they were created during the time periods indicated. Furthermore, we've cross-referenced the dates and events mentioned in these records with contemporary newspaper accounts, police reports, and other historical documents. The correlation is exact." She let that sink in before continuing. "We're also in possession of a statement from Marcus Cooper, identifying your son as his attacker and stating that the Hartley family was involved in orchestrating the assault. Mr. Cooper has been recovering additional memories as his brain heals, and he now recalls specific details of the attack, including words spoken by your son during the assault." This was partially a bluff. Marcus had recovered some fragments, enough to confirm his earlier statement, but the FBI was implying he remembered more than he actually did. It was a gamble, but Agent Torres had explained that sometimes the best way to get a confession was to make the suspect believe you already knew everything. Additionally, Agent Torres said, "We're reopening the investigation into the death of Thomas Reeves, a former Hartley hospitality employee who died in a suspicious car accident 6 months ago. We have reason to believe his death was connected to his willingness to provide testimony about criminal activity within your organization." The lawyers erupted. Objections, demands for evidence, threats of lawsuits. But Harrison Hartley sat very still, his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was surprisingly quiet. "What do you want?" Agent Torres leaned forward. "Your son pleads guilty to aggravated battery with intent to commit great bodily harm. He serves real prison time, no less than 8 years. You cooperate fully with our investigation into your business practices, including any knowledge you have of your father's activities. In exchange, we don't pursue murder charges related to Raymond Beaumont's disappearance. We don't make these historical documents public in their entirety, and your family gets to maintain some small shred of reputation." Harrison's head snapped up. "Murder charges? You can't prove, can't we?" Agent Torres pulled out another document, one I hadn't seen before. "This is a sworn statement from Eleanor Higgins, your family's former head housekeeper, who worked for your father from 1969 to 1982. Mrs. Higgins is 91 years old and currently in hospice care. She provided this statement last week, knowing she has nothing left to lose. She corroborates everything in the Cooper documents and adds several details of her own, including witnessing your father give instructions for the disposal of a body in March of 1974. The room went silent. I didn't know Mrs. Higgins was still alive. I didn't know the FBI had found her. But I understood now why my mother had always told us there were others like her, other invisible women who watched and remembered and waited. Harrison Hartley's face seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds. He turned to look at his son, and something passed between them, fear, perhaps, or the recognition that the empire they'd built on other people's suffering was finally crumbling. Vincent broke first. "I didn't mean to hurt him that badly," he said, his voice cracking. "Dad said just rough him up, scare him into selling. I didn't know he'd end up." "Vincent!" "Shut up," Harrison snapped. But it was too late. The lawyers were scrambling, but the damage was done. Vincent had admitted to the attack and implicated his father in the conspiracy. In a federal building, on the record. What followed took 4 hours of negotiation. The lawyers fought for every concession they could get, but Agent Torres had all the leverage. In the end, the deal was worse for the Hartleys than her initial offer. Vincent pleaded guilty to attempted murder. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in state prison. Harrison pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and agreed to cooperate with a full investigation of Hartley hospitality. The investigation ultimately revealed decades of fraud, bribery, and tax evasion totaling over $50 million. Harrison avoided prison because of his cooperation and age, but he paid $23 million in fines and restitution, lost his seat on every board he'd sat on, and was forced to sell the family business to pay legal fees. The Beaumont case was reopened. Raymond Beaumont's remains were eventually found based on information Harrison provided as part of his cooperation agreement. His wife Corinne had been right all along. He hadn't run away. He'd been murdered and buried in a construction site that later became a Hartley-owned parking garage. Raymond's remaining family, 2 children and 5 grandchildren, finally got closure 50 years after he disappeared. My mother's notebooks and Mrs. Higgins's testimony became part of the historical record. Scholars wrote about them. Journalists covered the story. The name Hartley went from being synonymous with Chicago fine dining to being a cautionary tale about the arrogance of power. And Marcus? Marcus's hand healed better than anyone expected. The physical therapist said it was his determination, his refusal to give up on his dream. He had to modify his technique, had to learn new ways to hold a knife and move around a kitchen. But within 18 months, he was back at his restaurant, cooking food that made people cry with joy. He bought out Vincent's share at fair market value, using money from the restitution fund. He renamed the restaurant Delphine's, after the grandmother he never met but whose patience and courage had saved his life. The night Delphine's reopened, Marcus asked me to say a few words. I stood in front of a room full of family, friends, neighbors, food critics, and community members who'd supported Marcus through everything. My mother, Delphine Cooper, cleaned houses for wealthy families for 52 years, I said. She raised 3 children on what she earned, scrubbing other people's floors. The people she worked for never learned her last name. They never asked about her children or her dreams or her struggles. To them, she was invisible. I paused, looking around the room at the faces of my children and grandchildren, at Loretta and Agent Torres and Detective Okafor, at the community that had rallied around us. But invisible doesn't mean powerless. My mother watched. She listened. She remembered. And she wrote it all down because she understood something the powerful never do. The people who serve you see everything. We know your secrets. We know your crimes. And if you give us a reason, if you hurt our families, we will use what we know to bring you down. I raised my glass. To my mother, who taught me that dignity isn't about money or status. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. To Mrs. Higgins and all the other invisible women who kept the truth alive until the right moment came. And to Marcus, who showed us that dreams are worth fighting for, even when powerful people try to take them away. The room raised their glasses. Marcus had tears streaming down his face. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and the kitchen was cleaned up, Marcus and I sat alone at a corner table. He held my hand with his healed right hand, the one the doctors said might never work again. "Grandma, how did you know? How did you know Mama's notebooks would be enough?" "I didn't know," I admitted. "I hoped, I trusted, and I was patient." He shook his head. "I always thought you were just a housekeeper. No offense." I laughed. "Baby, there's no such thing as just a housekeeper. We're historians. We're witnesses. We're the people who keep the world running while others take the credit. And we're dangerous when we need to be. Because we're invisible? Because we're invisible. And because we remember. George and I visit our mother's grave every Sunday at Oakwood Cemetery, not far from where Ida B. Wells is buried. We bring flowers and we tell her about Marcus's latest reviews, about the young cooks he's training, about the scholarship fund he's set up for culinary students from the South Side. We tell her that her patience paid off, that her years of quiet watching and careful writing made a difference half a century later, that the people who thought they could get away with anything finally paid the price. And sometimes, when the wind comes off Lake Michigan just right, carrying the smell of the city she'd loved and served her whole life, I swear I can hear her voice. "Good, Ernestine. You did good. That's what matters in the end. Not wealth or power or whose name is on a building. Just doing right by your family and your community. Just refusing to let evil go unpunished." Pauline asks me sometimes if I regret what happened. If I feel guilty about destroying the Hartley family, taking away their money and their reputation, sending Vincent to prison. I don't. They made their choices. They chose to build their empire on violence and intimidation. They chose to see people like us as disposable, as low-quality problems to be eliminated when we got in their way. They chose to attack my grandson because his success made them look bad, because a black chef from the South Side wasn't supposed to outshine their fancy establishments. They forgot that the invisible people are always watching, always remembering, always waiting for the right moment. My mother taught me that patience is the most dangerous weapon the powerless have. The powerful think in terms of quarters and news cycles. They want immediate results. They're impatient. But people like us? We think in generations. We pass down stories and records and warnings. We wait decades if we have to. And when the moment finally comes, we strike. Marcus is safe now. His restaurant is thriving. He's engaged to a wonderful woman named Keisha, who teaches 3rd grade at a public school on the South Side. They're talking about having children, giving me great-grandchildren to spoil. Harrison Hartley died last year, alone in a nursing home. His children barely visited. His grandchildren wanted nothing to do with the family name. The empire Morton Hartley built through violence and corruption is gone, scattered like ashes in the wind. And I'm 68 years old. I still clean houses sometimes, not because I need the money anymore, but because I like the routine. I like walking into beautiful homes and knowing that I see everything, remember everything, and matter more than anyone suspects. The invisible women are always the most dangerous. We've learned to be patient. We've learned to document. We've learned to wait for the moment when justice and evidence align. And when that moment comes, we strike like lightning. So when my granddaughter Keisha asks me, when she's sitting across from me at Delphine's and the kitchen is sending out dishes that make me prouder than I can say, how I stayed so calm through all of it, through the FBI and the lawyers and the trial, I tell her what my mother told me. Baby, powerful people think they're invincible because no one has ever made them pay for their crimes. But invisible people see everything. And if you're patient enough, if you document carefully enough, if you wait for the exact right moment, you can bring down empires. Just with patience? She asks. Patience, I say. And the truth. The truth is the most powerful weapon in the world. It just takes time to load.